Hi everyone. This lecture is going to cover the first two acts of Othello, and my goal overall is just to help us review the text and dig into it a little bit more and to share my insights that I've gained over the years of engaging this play and reading it and watching it and thinking through it. So before I get started, just a couple of assumptions I want to start with. The first one is, just to keep us grounded here, why are we spending time on Shakespeare? I suppose the most important reason is because Shakespeare is really important in the development of Western literature and in drama, in playwriting in particular. I think we all probably understand that, although most of us wander around thinking, well, why is he really that important? Um, Nonetheless, for a lot of reasons, he's super important, and I think as educated persons, you all should gain some exposure to Shakespeare. So that's the first assumption. Second assumption is I am not of the opinion, like I think some teachers might be out there, that Shakespeare is somehow automatically easy, or that if we just take the time to read him, we will somehow, automatically see his beauties and understand what he's saying, and so on. While I do believe that Shakespeare offers us universal themes and a very humane exploration of the human condition, and is a beautiful writer and one of the best in English, I am not of the opinion that it's easy or that 400 years later he still speaks to us automatically and in exactly the same way he spoke to his contemporary audiences. I think he is important. That does not mean I don't think he takes a lot of work. So I do think it takes work to read and understand a Shakespeare play, even at a basic level sometimes. So if you're experiencing headache and challenge, that's good. That's expected. I would assume you would. This is 400-year-old English, and then it's not automatically available to us in the way a podcast made today would be. The third thing is this lecture is a review of what you have already read. So I'm assuming you have read Acts 1 and 2 of the play for yourself at least once, and hopefully you have reviewed it at least once, and then you've also read the other materials that I've provided for you, so that this will help us review and dig, and this will not be an introduction to these first two acts. Fourth thing, I assume I would suggest you have your text of the play out while you're watching this. You will see throughout this lecture I'm going to cite some lines and passages. Sometimes I'll read a few lines here and there, but for the most part I will cite passages. And those can be moments where I invite you to pause your video and to go and look those passages up and read them just as I'm talking about them. Because I think it'll make a lot more sense if you pause when I cite something, or at least maybe a handful of passages, and then take a minute to go back and read them for yourself in conjunction with what I'm saying. Finally, of course, I can't cover everything about the play. Nobody can cover everything about any given work of literature. Literature's meanings can be deep, rich, and sometimes inexhaustible. So I'm just pointing out some things that I have thought about and some elements that I want you to pay attention to in these first two acts and as you read the play. So in this lecture, we're going to take a look at the play's genre and origins very briefly, because that should be review if you've worked through the module I provided for you. We'll look at some assumptions about Shakespeare's language. We'll take a look at the main characters that we've seen so far, some observations and things to note about them. We'll take a look at some elements of dramatic structure, that is, how is Shakespeare using things like setting and some motifs or thematic elements to structure the drama so far. And we'll finish up with some things I want you to pay attention to and think about as you finish the rest of the play for next time. So briefly, let's review the genre and origins. Othello was first performed in 1604. That's the first known recorded performance. So 400 years ago and some change, right? The original plot was adapted because Shakespeare adapted. He never invented new, where he could borrow and steal and rewrite something that already existed. He adapted from Italian writer Cinthio's book, the Hecatominthi, which is a collection of 100 stories in Italian that became pretty popular in the 16th century. A bunch of short stories, really, is what these were. And one of the stories, the story that he used as a basic plot, was the story of Desdemona and the Moor. Notice not only is Desdemona spelled differently, but we don't get a title character in that original title. We just get the Moor. Shakespeare titled his play The Tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice. So he adapts this original story into this play, a tragedy, and we notice the subtitle is The Moor of Venice. This is highlighting Othello's Moorish background. That is, a Muslim, usually of darker skin color, was known as a Moor. And the Moors, from the European perspective, had been making inroads into Western Europe for a number of centuries. They were a political and religious force, and this marks our title hero, our titular hero here, as an outsider. He is a Moor. We'll talk a little bit about racial issues, but in general, we know that Othello was conceived of as a black man. Whatever that blackness looked like for early modern English people may not be the same as it is for us, but he is certainly marked as an outsider, as a Moor, who has probably converted to Christianity and is now living in Venice as part of Europe. Okay, but he is still marked as an outsider. We need to note that Shakespeare adapts. One thing to mark about this play is one thing that Shakespeare surprisingly adapts in this play, which is a tragedy. It's not going to end well. Is he actually uses a traditional comic plot for this play as well. The comic plot of the jealous husband duped into believing his wife is unfaithful to him. This is usually a comedy plot, especially in Italian drama of the period. So Shakespeare takes something that can traditionally be a comedic plot, something funny, the old husband who's jealous of his young wife, and turns it into something quite tragic, which we'll see as we wrap up the play next time. And then here's the cover page of the original publication. You can see how the title was conceived up here, right? The Tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice, and then it describes how it's been acted. This is kind of a reference to, I suppose our modern version of this would be now a major motion picture, as it has been diverse times acted at the Globe and at the Blackfriars by His Majesty's servants. So it's the original title page. So let's take a look at some assumptions about the language of this tragedy, one of Shakespeare's major tragedies. First thing you should note, people didn't talk like this in real life, so please don't think that. Please don't think that 400 years ago English people walked around speaking this highfalutin poetic diction as an everyday thing. No, of course not. This was poetic language. It was heard as poetic language. There wasn't an expectation that people on stage would act and talk in a realistic fashion. That's an assumption. There's a theatrical idiom we call theatrical realism. And that became fashionable in the 19th century and afterwards. And I want to note that we're really used to theatrical realism today. We want our theater and our films at some level to be realistic, but that's actually a relatively new thing in the history of drama. Before the 19th century, we didn't assume that plays were supposed to be realistic, as if we were watching somebody's living room through a transparent fourth wall. So we just want to point that out, that we aren't to assume this was to be realistic. That's our own modern assumption. It didn't apply to Shakespeare's theater, or indeed to theater going for most of recorded history. People listened to plays in this period. The primary mode to hear of receiving a play was through the ear, as some of your materials have already taught you. So it was a very oral, A-U-R-A-L, of the ear kind of experience. Why were plays often written in poetry? Not always, but quite often in this period. They were written in poetry and in English plays in iambic pentameter. There could be a number of reasons for this, but I think the most basic reason that helps us understand this is really a practical one. It's much easier to memorize lines of poetry than it is to memorize prose, because you can go line by line to memorize it. Why was this important? Actors in Shakespeare's time actually put on several different plays a week. That is, different plays a week. And in those plays they had in repertory, there were several old plays. They were usually popular plays that they knew people wanted to see over and over again, and at least 1 to 2 brand new plays a week. So the same actors played different parts in these different plays. They had to hold in memory, on occasion, thousands of lines every week, and every week thousands of new lines from the new plays. So this is a big burden on memory, and writing plays in verse makes them much easier to memorize the parts. So let's take a look at some of the main characters now. I'm taking these essentially in order of appearance, and I will have more to say about this when we look at some issues of dramatic structuring. So let's first look at Iago. We want to note at first, if you missed it, he has, what's his plan? He has a plan he is developing against Othello. Well, he wants to convince Othello over the course of the play that his new wife, Desdemona, has been unfaithful to him with Cassio. You can read one clear explanation of his plan in Act 1, Scene 3, in lines 376 to 86. So you can read that passage where Iago tells us what his plan is, what he wants to do at that point. This could be a moment where you pause this lecture video and go look at those 10 lines yourself to see what they say. We also know he's going to use Roderigo to help him out. He's going to manipulate Roderigo. Well, he's going to manipulate everybody, really, but Roderigo is kind of his wingman here. He's going to help him out to perpetrate this terrible plan against Othello. So the question might arise, and for centuries, readers and critics have wondered, why? Why does Iago want to do this? Why does he want to hurt this general that he serves? Well, on the one hand, Iago gives us several stated reasons, and what's interesting to note is those reasons actually kind of change over the course of the play. We see in Act 1, Scene 1, he's really hacked off at Othello for passing him over for a promotion. Iago is called the ensign, right? Or the ancient, I'm sorry. He's Othello's ancient, which is kind of his old servant, right? The soldier that's been with him a long time. And Othello promoted Cassio to the role of lieutenant, which is really the right-hand man of the general, right? And he's passed over Iago for this promotion. And that really hacks off Iago. He thinks that Cassio is a pretty boy, that he is a bookish man, that he has not really learned through experience in the field, but that he has learned through sort of books and schooling, and as such he is sort of effeminate in a way and doesn't deserve the position. But then Iago also says at the end of Scene 3 in Act 1 that he's jealous because he thinks that Othello has been sleeping with his wife, Emilia. We should be surprised by that because it's the first mention made of it. And yet that's something that Iago states. It is thought twixt my sheets he has done my office, Iago tells us in that speech. So that's interesting. There's no evidence in the play to actually back this up. It seems to be his imagination, but he does claim it. But then later on, at the end of Act 1, at the end of Act 2, Scene 1, he then says in a couple of lines that he loves Desdemona as well. Although it does seem that even in that speech, he says he loves her, but that's not the real reason he's doing this. We see his reasons change, so keep an eye on those reasons that he gives. But I want us to hold on and think for a second, because our temptation is to find motivation for Iago. We always want motive, and contemporary theater and acting tells us that we're supposed to find motives for people. And when we read novels, we want motives as well. But one thing about Iago is he always seems to defy our reasoning. He gives these motives, but it never seems, at least to my mind, that any of them are entirely satisfying. This problem came to Samuel Taylor Coleridge's attention in the 19th century when he said famously that Iago's stated reasons were the motive hunting of a motiveless malignity. Coleridge thought that Iago was offering these various reasons for hating the Moor, for hating Othello, but he also thought that they were motive hunting, that Iago probably didn't really believe them himself, that he was sort of exploring and presenting these reasons to justify his actions, but none of them were actually real or satisfactory. So I think you might have to pay attention to that yourself. Do you think that Iago has real reasons, or is he sort of making them up? Does the play ever actually support any of his claims and his reasoning? Finally, with Iago, one other thing we might think about is Iago can be thought of as growing out of a particular stock character in the medieval tradition. And that would be the vice figure. In medieval drama, you often had something called the psychomachia. That's a big fancy Greek word for something that you're probably familiar with, and that is anytime you see a character being spoken to by an angel on the one shoulder and a devil on the other shoulder. That should make sense to you, right? The psychomachia occurred in medieval drama sometimes to portray the inner spiritual drama of a human being torn between temptation to do evil and the promptings to do good. So some critics have pointed out that Iago, as a character, owes a lot to the tradition of the vice figure, the vice figure in that medieval tradition. And that might help us think about him as a character as well. That part of his role in the play is as a whispering tempter to Othello, someone who's going to tempt Othello into jealousy and envy and madness. So that's Iago. Okay. And I'll have more to say about Iago towards the end of this as well, because there's a lot to say about Iago, of course. Rodrigo is the next character sort of appearing in the play. And he's a comic figure, and he's hopelessly in love with Desdemona, and he's kind of a loser. Everybody thinks he's a loser, which is funny, really. Kind of sad, but funny. He's totally a loser. Brabantio, the father of Desdemona, has essentially said that he doesn't have a chance. Get away from my house and my daughter. And Iago certainly doesn't respect him. But he is a comic figure, another kind of stock figure. And if you recall from previous reading, stock characters, they're flat characters in literature and in drama we all recognize them. They're shorthand for a kind of character. We have a lot of them in our even contemporary movies and film, right? So like the mad scientist is a stock character. And we can probably see the mad scientist or variations of this figure throughout movies and popular TV, right? We can also see the gritty detective hero as a stock character. Action movies that are built around a kind of a distasteful law enforcement person or heroic figure who's really kind of dark and gritty, but who gets the job done, right? So those are examples of stock characters for today. Rodrigo is kind of a stock figure from the 16th and 17th century as well, a comic lover who is hopelessly pathetic and a loser and has no chance with the main character, but sort of hangs out nonetheless and serves other people's purposes. He's Iago's victim in a number of ways, including Iago duping him for a lot of money, which you might review at the end of Act 1, in that final exchange between Iago and Rodrigo. Iago repeatedly tells Rodrigo to fill thy purse with money, put money in thy purse, which Iago is basically going to dupe Rodrigo out of, telling him that he's using that money to court Desdemona for him, which, of course, he's not. He's just filching the money for himself. It's kind of funny. Rodrigo lets us see Iago's manipulation. That's one of the purposes he plays. He's another way that we can see Iago's machinations being drawn against other people. So that's Rodrigo. Kind of a pathetic figure that we should watch throughout the play. We have Brabantio. That's Desdemona's father. He's an important senator in Venice. Very important, actually. So important that the Duke himself says that whoever has stolen his daughter will be punished as severely as Brabantio wants, even if the man stealing his daughter were the Duke's own son. We learn that in Act 1, Scene 3. We should note his daughter Desdemona has eloped, and Brabantio can't fathom that it's because she wanted a Moor, that is, a black man, as a husband. That should give us pause, right? From the very beginning and throughout, Brabantio hates the idea that Desdemona could even run off with this man. He even says the only way it could have happened is because somehow the Moor, Othello, must have used like magic spells and charms to fool his daughter into falling in love with him. He repeats this at the end of Act 1, Scene 1, and then Act 1, Scene 3 as well, before the Senate, before the Duke. He's also another Shakespeare, a kind of stock character, and we see this particular one in Shakespeare plays a lot. The possessive father, right? The father who is possessive of his daughter and who ends up being duped in some ways by her disobedience and or for her disobedient love for a man that he hasn't chosen for her. So that's Brabantio kind of draws on that stock character tradition as well. He cares very much about his honor. Iago plays on this, in fact, in Act 1, Scene 1, when um, when Brabantio yells out from the balcony above, which is his bedroom window, "Thou art a villain," he yells at the men in the street. And Iago says, "You are a senator." And kind of at that moment that Brabantio realizes, oh crap, this is my reputation on the line, and I need to act quickly on this because I'm a senator, I'm an important person, and my honor's at stake here. We should note that Brabantio warns Othello about Desdemona's disobedience in the last lines we will see him speak in this part of the play. Actually, the last lines we'll hear from him at all, where he says to Othello, "Look to her more, if thou hast eyes to see. She deceived her father, and may thee." They're sort of poignant lines because Brabantio feels cheated out of his daughter, and he never accepts this marriage. Throughout the rest of the play, he will not accept the marriage. And he plants a seed in Othello's head that reminds Othello that Desdemona did elope. She deceived her father. Now, at this point, this is Brabantio's rage against Othello speaking. But nonetheless, this becomes a line that must play in Othello's mind at some point, making him doubt a little bit. He'll actually refer to it. Othello will refer to this line later in the play. Let's take a look at Othello. He's the tragic hero. He's the titular hero of the play. But what will that mean? Well, Aristotle said that the tragic hero, is a great figure who falls through hamartia, some sort of flaw. Now, that may help us a little bit, but I don't want us to think that Aristotle is the only theorist of tragedy that is helpful here. Shakespeare had his own version of what a tragic hero might be, and he was certainly not, although he could be indebted to Aristotle in this, he is certainly not a slave to Aristotle. But one thing that it might mean, right, is a hero like this is flawed in some way. There's some sort of human flaw that we can watch people sort of use to turn against him, or a flaw that makes him vulnerable to people around him. So we need to think throughout this play, what are Othello's potential flaws or weaknesses? Well, let me offer a few, and you can think of more as you read the play. He's an outsider in multiple ways, lots of ways. He's a black man, right? He's a Moor. And that means not only is he black, but he's also religiously originally an outsider, although it seems clear he's a convert to Christianity because there is reference to his baptism and, as a Christian and so on. So he's no longer a practicing Muslim, let's say, in the play, but he's originally outside of this civilization. And he's also a hired hand. We should note that in Venice, he is the most important general to save the Venetians from the Turks. The Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, by the way, is also represents an outside force. And in this case, the Turks represent Islam. They also represent a kind of threat to Christian civilization in the world of the play. And Othello is a general that they are hiring to protect Venice. But notice, Othello doesn't actually seem to have a house. Where do we find him in the play? Where are they supposed to send for him? He's at a place called the Sagittary. The Sagittary is an inn. That's the name of an inn. It's a hotel. He doesn't actually have a house in Venice. So he's an outsider from Venice, even though Venice has use for him. We should note that Othello is consumed with the notion of honor, and that somehow honor is going to save him. Right? It will speak on his behalf, that it's self-evident and it's almost a magical protector of his reputation. In fact, that's what he says in the very first speeches he is given in the play. He calls his soul perfect, and he says, it doesn't matter, we'll go before the Senate chamber, and my honor and reputation will speak for me. That may not be, he relies on that, but that might be a weakness, as we'll see in the play. Might make him naive also. Othello seems to trust the very man he should not trust, so much so that he refers to Iago, and by the way, other characters do as well, as honest Iago many, many times in the play. Honest Iago, which should strike the audience as bitterly ironic because Iago is a liar, and a manipulator, and he will cause Othello's downfall because people believe him too much. We should also note that Othello is an excellent speaker and an excellent storyteller. In fact, if you review his lengthy and very famous speech before the senators in Act 1, Scene 3, he describes how he won the hand of Desdemona in marriage. Now, I'm not going to recite the speech for you, and if we were in our face-to-face class, I totally would. But you go back and reread that, and you'll see that his story here before the Senate is he would come to Brabantio's house. Brabantio would actually have him over, and he would tell stories at dinner, wonderful exotic stories about his past and his history. And Desdemona, while she was kind of moving to and fro, taking care of the house business, possibly serving, would hear these stories. She'd overhear them. And Othello noticed Desdemona listening, and there seems to be this really subtle interplay in their personalities. He noticed her noticing. So he kind of planned to make sure he was telling good stories when she was nearby. And then she sort of listened more and teased out of him more stories, which he then took as a cue to tell her some more. And so he uses this beautiful storytelling to create a sense of pity and love in her for him. And that's how he wins her love. It's really kind of a beautiful, beautiful thing, but also very, very subtle and very intricate in its human interplay. We should look at Desdemona. Like Othello, she is an adept and very savvy speaker. In fact, her speech before the Senate is very well modulated because her father puts her on the spot. Who do you owe obedience to? He says to her. Now, that's a very damning question, right? Because however she answers, she's in the wrong. If she says, I owe obedience to you, Dad, then he will have to say, well, then you've disobeyed me. So you violated your obedience to me. And if she says, well, I owe obedience to Othello, then Brabantio is going to say, like, well, no, I'm your father. You owe obedience to me, and so you're in the wrong. But Desdemona says, I perceive here a divided duty. And she talks about how she owes obedience to her father for some things, but then also owes obedience to Othello for other things in the same way that her mother owed obedience to Brabantio, her father. So she's very intelligent and speaks extremely well to get out of that situation. But we also know she's married against her father's wishes. This has also made her a bit of an outsider, at least to Brabantio. She has risked and given up something here. We'll also see later in the play that she has given up marriageability. She has married outside the social circle, and that is also a big sacrifice for her, we will learn. Again, we'll note that she fell in love with Othello's storytelling and his virtue, as she says in 1:3-249 through 60. I saw Othello's visage in his mind, meaning I didn't see his face, but I saw his virtues. I saw his mind, the beauty of his mind. As you're reading the play, think about how beautiful and powerful Desdemona is, or is she? Again, this is a moment to think about performance choices. A lot depends on who you cast for your Desdemona. You can have a very savvy and intelligent, mature Desdemona who has seen the world and has bided her time and has been very selective in a husband. We can also have a Desdemona that is quite young and maybe innocent and maybe even a bit foolish sometimes. That a lot of that will depend on who you cast as her. And you want to pay attention to any potential flaws as we continue the play. I think you can see there might be some flaws, or at least things that she has done that contribute to her situation, her developing situation. And finally, we'll just take a brief look at a few of the other characters, which you're going to see more of in Acts 3, 4, and 5. We have Cassio. He's bookish, it seems to be, according to Iago anyway, but he's very suave. It seems like he's got a reputation with the ladies. We'll even see that there's a courtesan named Bianca later on that he is stringing along, and she loves him very much. We can also note he's a bit of a snob. When he gets drunk in Act 2, Scene 3, it's clear that he's drunk by that point. Iago has gotten him drunk. We see that in his drunkenness, Cassio talks about things like salvation, right? Being saved. And he says that the lieutenant should be saved before the ancient, meaning he himself, the lieutenant, should ultimately be saved before the ancient, or Iago, presumably because of the rank that he has. It's as if he thinks that rank is so important that even God will respect it on Judgment Day. So Cassio might be a bit naive as well. Iago seems to think so, since Cassio was concerned about his reputation, perhaps overly much. But nonetheless, we should look at Cassio as the play continues to unfold. Emilia, one of my favorites. We haven't seen too much from her. She ends up being a serving woman to Desdemona, and she's also Iago's wife. So she comes along on the trip to Cyprus to serve as Desdemona's waiting lady. And we'll see a little bit more about the marriage between Emilia and Iago as the play unfolds. Emilia seems a bit savvy and sometimes a bit hard around the edges, maybe a bit jaded. In some productions of Othello, Emilia is portrayed as maybe a sort of abused woman in some ways. She has borne a lot of grief from Iago, who we imagine may not be all that pleasant to be married to. And that part of the play explores that domestic violence through Emilia. Again, we don't have to see that in the play, but I have seen versions of the play where that is the way they portray Emilia. We might note that she becomes, in the last half of the play, a sort of female ally to Desdemona as well. We'll see Emilia and Desdemona enjoy a kind of relationship as it develops in the rest of the play. Okay, so much for the main characters so far. Let's take a look at some elements of dramatic structure. That is, some motifs, some thematic elements that help us structure and think about the play. Recall that a motif is sort of like a theme, but a motif can be thought of as a thematic element or a sort of topic that comes back again and again throughout a work of art, throughout a play or throughout a work of literature, that is held up to us repeatedly as a way that the work is structured or organized, or a way that symbolism works in it, a way that it explores its issues. We talked about that in The Violent Bear It Away, for example, different motifs that emerge there. Well, one motif that emerges in this play is the motif of light versus darkness and white versus black. We'll see this throughout. Obviously, racially, the play has a lot to say about the racial issues, with Othello as a black man in a white Venice, for example. But we should note the play begins in nighttime, in blackness, and not coincidentally, also ends at nighttime in the final scene. We should note that the movement of the play, even in these first two acts, is a movement from darkness to light, right? We begin in darkness in the street. Brabantio wants a candle lit as if to throw light on the situation. And even Iago, ironically, talks about his plot as a movement from darkness to light. At the end of scene 3 of Act 1, he says he will act basically as a midwife to give birth, to give a monstrous birth to the world's light. So he's going to act as a midwife to birth this plan to the light of the world, which is very deeply disturbing. The Duke of Venice has a little racial moment where he points out that interplay between blackness and whiteness, and the uncomfortable way that blackness and whiteness can be associated with vice and virtue, where the Duke of Venice says to Brabantio at the end of the Senate scene, he says to Brabantio, "If virtue no delighted beauty lack, your son-in-law is far more fair than black." It's a compliment to Othello, but it's also a recognition that it's his virtue that makes Othello fair, and fairness is associated with whiteness, and that's counterposed to blackness. We want to watch how this motif develops, that light versus dark, the white versus black, the idea of bringing truth to light and truth being shrouded in darkness. It gets played with a lot in this play. We'll also want to look at the motif of reason versus passion, which is overlaid in a way with the Venetians versus the Turks. This play is very interested in the importance of reason controlling our passions and what might happen if we give ourselves over to passion. Othello himself holds up this distinction in Act 2, Scene 3, where he gets angry at the riotous behavior of Cassio and Montano and everybody else, where he says, "Are we turned Turks, and to ourselves do that which heaven hath forbid the Ottomites?" There's that notion of turning Turk that is turning into an outsider, in this case a particularly non-Christian, non-European outsider, which is associated with passion or the irrational, right? A lack of discipline. So Othello recognizes that, and you'll see that throughout the play. And Othello suggests the loss of himself to passion as well. He seems to fear by the end of Act 2 that he might be being swayed a little bit more by passion than he wanted to be, than he planned to be. He says, "My blood begins my safer guides to rule, and passion, having my best judgment collied, essays to lead the way." This is where he's so angry at the men for rioting and for not acting like good soldiers. That he says he's getting angry enough that he's losing a little bit of control of it, that passion is overruling his reason. Want to keep an eye on that, because he will come back to this as he starts to fall into jealousy throughout Act 3 and 4 of the play. He feels like he's being taken over by passion and losing judgment. So watch how that motif unfolds and how Othello changes. Now, we may also lay onto this a shift in the setting. This play underlines that motif of the reason versus passion, or logic versus passion, control versus passion, in the way its setting shifts. The play begins in Venice, begins with military conflict in Venice and political intrigue in Venice. And that's supposed to sort of represent civilization, I guess, or a kind of the reasonable part of things, although we might want to ask, how great is this? We have a civilization here that is willing to pay this outsider to lead it in battle, but not apparently willing to fully accept it as a marriageable man in that society. So we begin in Venice, but then we shift in Act 2 to Cyprus. Right? This island of Cyprus, it's traditionally associated with the birth of Venus in mythology. If we think back to our mythology, Venus is the goddess of erotic love, of sexuality and eros. She's, in one version of the myth, she is born out of the Mediterranean Sea, and as she is born, she comes to shore at Cyprus. And we note that her birth is different from the birth of Minerva, who, according to the myth, sprung out of Jupiter's head. Minerva, of course, is the goddess of wisdom. She's identical to the Greek goddess Athena. So Venus is erotic love. And we should note the play shifts to Cyprus, which is associated with Venus and associated with passion. In fact, here is a painting, a very famous Renaissance painting by Botticelli, called The Birth of Venus. And we should note this is her coming to shore at Cyprus, and note that the nude human form is foregrounded here. We should note that she is, of course, naturally nude, and you'll see this figure here is attempting to cover her, right, to remind us of the fact that she is the goddess of erotic love. She is naked and born that way, and she stands in a sort of contradistinction to things like modesty and restraint. Okay, hold that image in your mind as we cover this next thing. Because we need to ask, I always ask myself in this play, why do we get this weird scene in 2-1? It's this weird scene where we shift to Cyprus and everybody's hanging out on the seaside, waiting and watching these ships. And there's a lot of banter between Iago and Cassio, and eventually Desdemona and Montano, who's the governor of the island. And a lot of it's frankly boring and sort of cryptic. Iago is making up these rhymes about women, and not a lot of action happens. We seem to be waiting. So I always ask myself, why in the heck do we have this scene? Well, here are some suggestions I have to answer that question. These aren't, airtight or definitive, but I hold them up as potential reasons for why Shakespeare wants this scene here. One of them is it eliminates the Turkish threat in one fell swoop. If you read that scene, you'll see that the huge storm has taken out the entire Turkish threat. And all of a sudden, we no longer have the threat from the Turkish fleet, and the play is now it's no longer about political threats from the outside at all. It's gone. All the planning from the first act, and especially from that Senate scene in 1-3, is gone. The fleet's destroyed. So now what do we have left? We have the main plot of Desdemona, Iago, and Othello. The scene also gives us some extended conversation between Iago, Emilia, Desdemona, and Cassio. Maybe Shakespeare wants us to see that, and that lets us see a different side of Iago. We get to see his wit and charm, and see him joking about females, of course at females' expense, because some of the rhymes he makes up are pretty derogatory against women. And we also get more of a sense of the marriage between Emilia and Iago. They seem to rib each other. Iago makes fun of her for her, cursed tongue and being a scold and a nag. And Emilia clearly holds her own against Iago in this scene. We also get a gesture to that birth of Venus moment associated with Desdemona coming on shore. Remember back here, this picture. That's the birth of Venus. I would argue one of the reasons we get this scene is it highlights the drama of waiting for Desdemona to show up and waiting for that dramatic shift from politics and the Turkish threat to eros, to passion, to erotic love. Desdemona comes ashore, and we get her praised by Cassio when she arrives, where Cassio says, "Oh, behold, the riches of the ship is come on shore. You men of Cyprus, let her have your knees. Hail to thee, lady, and the grace of heaven before, behind thee, and on every hand, and wheel thee round." I mean, Cassio's having some fun here. He's using the opening of a prayer, the Hail Mary, when he praises Desdemona. He's having some fun. It's supposed to be lightly comical. But it does foreground this notion, this allusion. If you think back to allusion and mythology in our unit during our poetry time, there's a reference here to this movement to Eros, to Cyprus and the birth of Venus and erotic love. Iago actually further highlights this when he says, at the end of scene 3 in Act 2, when he's telling us what he's going to do, he makes a reference to Venus as well when he says that he will take Desdemona's goodness and out of that goodness make the net that shall enmesh them all. This is a well-known myth at the time. In that myth that he's referring to there, Venus's husband is the old blacksmith, Vulcan, right, in the Roman pantheon. And Venus is having this hot affair with Mars, the god of war, and Vulcan gets wind of it, and he sets up an iron net in their bed to trap Venus and Mars in the act, and so they can be held up, trapped in the net as a mockery to the rest of the gods. So even Iago is referring to the Venus narrative here as well. Okay, so we also want to note in this play that Othello, we don't get to see Othello until the second scene of the play. He's withheld from our view for a whole scene, and Desdemona is withheld for one scene more. We might want to think about why do we get this? Why does Shakespeare do this? And one reason is it allows us as the audience to see how others think of the main character before we even see or know them. It allows us to see how others talk about Othello and see his place in society before we get to see him and judge for ourselves. We should note that in Act 1, Scene 1, that it's not a very nice picture we get of Othello. We get him mocked with bitterly racist slurs and animal imagery. In 1-1, one of the ways that Iago and Rodrigo get Brabantio fired up is to repeatedly make reference to his daughter being tupped by a black ram. An old black ram is tupping your white ewe, right? And they're making the beast with two backs. This is more than just dirty humor. This is racially charged dirty humor because Iago and Rodrigo are comparing Othello to an animal, to a brute animal, stealing Brabantio's daughter away in order to make it even more revolting to the old man, to Brabantio. And we see that Othello is an outsider before we even get to see Othello for ourselves. We should note that another effect of this withholding of Othello until the second scene is it helps us to see that there is conflict surrounding Othello, and in some ways he is passive to what happens to him to a great extent. So we get this action and this plotting against Othello. We get this sense of him being an outsider and this sense of him being alien and being useful to the Senate as well, which kind of gives us the impression that he's respected, yes, but he's also a passive figure, at least at this point. Note we also, in terms of the structure of this play, we spend the most time with Iago in the beginning 2 acts of this play. In fact, throughout the play, we'll spend the most time with Iago than many other characters. First, we should note that Iago is the 3rd largest role in all of Shakespeare. The next largest role in Shakespeare's work is Hamlet himself, and then the number 1 longest role is Richard III. The longest roles by line count. Iago is the 3rd longest. Just in the first 2 acts, we get 4 long speeches by Iago and 5 soliloquies and several asides. Why is this? Why do we get so much time with Iago? I think one reason is we spend time with Iago, and that aligns us with the villain. We're taken into his confidence. Remember, in soliloquies, that is Iago talking not to himself, but to us, to the audience. He's getting us into his confidence. As a result, we become sort of culpable with Iago because we know what's going on. We know what's going on. And the other characters don't. And this puts us in a really uncomfortable and weird situation where we know as much as the villain does, but nobody else does. And we have the very knowledge that could stop the horror and the tragedy from happening. It seems that Shakespeare wants us to be uncomfortably aligned with Iago by giving Iago so much stage time and so much occasion to talk directly to us as an audience. Just a few notes on verse before we wrap it up. Please note that most of the poetry in Shakespeare and in drama of this period is written in unrhymed iambic pentameter or blank verse, and again, that's to help us memorize it, help actors memorize it. There are a couple, you will note there are some times where there's rhyming that happens, and you might have heard that if you're listening to it on a YouTube clip or maybe watching a film version or reading it out loud to yourself. And I just wanted to highlight that this happens very often at the end of scenes, and there's a very good reason for that. On the Shakespearean stage, the outdoor theaters, there is no scenery really, and there are no curtains, and there are really there's no way to mark the end of a scene visually. So one way that playwrights marked the end of a scene, so this notion that that's the end of one scene and the beginning of another, is to have the lines rhyme in a couplet or two. And that could signal through the ear that, hey, this is the end of a scene. So you'll notice this again and again at the end of scenes in the first 2 acts. For the end of scene 2 in Act 1, where Brabantio says, "For if such actions may have passage free, bondslaves and pagans shall our statesmen be." That is, if a black man and a Moor like Othello can marry my daughter, he seems to be saying, then we might as well all be pagans and slaves. But notice it rhymes, free and be. That's the end of the scene. 1-3 ends with another rhyme. That's one by Iago. "Have it is engendered. Hell and night must bring this monstrous birth to the world's light." End of scene. 2-1 ends again with another couplet, again spoken by Iago. "'Tis here, but yet confused. Knavery's plain face is never seen till used." End of scene. And finally, 2-3 ends with another rhyming couplet. "Aye, that's the way. Dull not device by coldness and delay." So rhyming often marks the ends of scenes, so just be mindful of that. There's also a curious little patch of rhymed poetry when the Duke, in Act 1, Scene 3, he attempts to soothe Brabantio and tell him, hey, it's going to be okay. And he offers a whole speech full of rhyming couplets that are jingly and jangly and sing-songy. And the reason for that is that they're all morals. They're all sort of like, learn these little morals. They're what would be called sentences or brief statements of moral wisdom. And they're cliches, some of them, and he's attempting to comfort Brabantio. But of course, Brabantio, if you reread those lines in 1-3, he actually mocks the Duke right back by arguing against his easy wisdom, and he does so by using the same kind of rhyming couplets, as if he's saying like, hey, F you, Duke, you don't really believe this either, but I'm going to mock you using the same kind of rhyming that you just used with me. This attempt at rhyming by the Duke, by the way, may be an attempt of the Duke to control the messy situation, in much the way that the play is interested in the idea of passions being controlled by reason. And Brabantio might be pointing out that maybe passions aren't so easy to control after all. That's part of what he's suggesting in his arguing against the Duke. And finally, as you're reading, pay attention to when characters finish each other's lines. Lines can actually help determine pacing and energy of a scene. That is, sometimes characters finish each other's lines, and when that happens, sometimes it's because the lines are indicating the speed at which they're supposed to be said. So, for example, in Act 4, Scene 1, we begin with this little exchange between Iago and Othello, where the lines, Iago speaks a line and Othello ends it several times. And I think the idea here is it helps us understand that Iago and Othello is really listening to Iago and picking up on his lines and speaking very quickly with Iago. And the line and the way the lines are shared or split between the two actors helps to communicate that. Will you think so? I think so, Iago. What, to kiss in private? An unauthorized kiss? It's as if Othello is jumping right on what Iago is saying, like Iago has Othello stringing right along with him. Okay, so wrapping it up, as you read the next 3 acts and the rest of the play, some things to think about. Pay attention to how the plan unfolds, Iago's plan unfolds, and think about what has to fall into place for him to convince Othello that Desdemona has been unfaithful. A lot of things have to work out just right, and unfortunately they all do, so pay attention to how that plot works. Chart Othello's unraveling, because he will come unraveled. He will give himself over to jealousy and passion. Why does he believe what Iago says? And what counts as proof to Othello? On a related, we'll pay attention to this motif of race and identity. Be paying attention to who is inside and who is outside, right, in this culture, and why. Othello will become painfully aware of his status as an outsider as he becomes more and more convinced by Iago of Desdemona's unfaithfulness. So pay attention to how that motif works. On a related note to this notion of proof up here, another very important motif in this play is the tension between belief or faith on the one hand and doubt on the other. Faithfulness, right? The idea of trusting one's spouse. What makes Othello believe Iago instead of Desdemona? What makes him refuse to doubt Iago? Othello is a study in many ways of misplaced belief. He believes precisely the wrong things from the wrong people and believes and disbelieves the true things from the people he should be trusting. And why does that work? How does that work? What kind of statement is the play making about belief and trust on the one hand and doubt on the other? And who we place faith in and trust in our relationships. We also want to pay attention to this motif of male honor and aggression on the one hand versus females as objects. What agency do women seem to have in this world? Pay particular attention to Desdemona and to Emilia as the play unfolds. And in my final slide, how would you describe Desdemona as a character through the rest of the play? And how would you describe Emilia as a character through the rest of the play? Keep your eye on them. How does your opinion of Othello develop or change in Acts 3 to 5? Do you think he's heroic by the end? Do you pity him in the end? In what ways do you understand him as a tragic hero? Think about how he unfolds as a character. Take some time to review that last scene, climax. That's 5-2, I believe. It's a beautiful scene and a horrible scene. I'll probably lecture on that in my next lecture that I post for you. Want to ask yourself, by the end, does Iago get what he deserves? Or feel like you understand Iago or his motives? Where does he end up as a character? What do you think about that? And of course, as with all drama, try and read as much as you can with a theatrical imagination, asking yourself questions about how things could be performed. How might those performance choices shape the meanings of the text? And of course, please take advantage of various performances and movies and clips out there on Amazon Prime, on Netflix, on YouTube. There's plenty of stuff out there on Othello and on Shakespeare. There are several good film versions out there. Take advantage. Yes, read the text, engage the text as a reading experience using your theatrical imagination, but please also take advantage of watching performances and clips out there to see the different ways actors have tackled this very this profound and often beautiful and yes, difficult play.